What if Luis Jamiltón's radio outburst was not just a moment of frustration, but a calculated exposure of a silent war within Ferrari? Behind the calm smiles and corporate unity, has Leclerc been secretly favored all along, receiving the best parts, strategies, and support, while a seven-time world champion is forced to fight with scraps? Jamiltón's words may have sounded emotional, but the data, the patterns, and the silence from the team speak volumes. If even Ferrari is willing to sideline a legend to protect their golden boy, then what does that say about the integrity of the sport? The truth is out, and it is far more explosive than a radio message. The silence in the garage was deafening, but it was not the kind born from failure. It was the aftermath of something far more unsettling. When Luis Jamiltón unleashed a sharp, calculated outburst through the team radio, it was not the typical expression of frustration heard during high-pressure moments. This time it was different. This time it was deliberate. His tone carried years of experience, layers of distrust, and a piercing sense of urgency. Those listening closely realized immediately, this was not about the moment. This was a statement, a warning, a provocation directed not at his rivals, but at the very engineer responsible for being his lifeline in the car. And when Jamiltón speaks with that kind of precision, you know something beneath the surface has fractured. What made the moment so impactful was not just what was said, but when and how it was said. Luis Jamiltón, a driver known for his composure under pressure, is not easily pushed to the edge. For him to make a public declaration over the radio, knowing full well that it would be broadcast and dissected by millions, suggests a deeper strategy. He wanted the world to hear it, not just the engineer. And by doing so, he shifted the spotlight from on-track performance to a more uncomfortable conversation: internal misalignment within Ferrari. While the content of the radio message has sparked endless speculation, its implications are even louder. Why did Jamiltón feel compelled to provoke his engineer on a global stage? What has been happening behind closed doors that pushed him to use the team's own communication channel as a weapon? The engineers at Ferrari are widely regarded for their technical mastery, but communication breakdowns are not new. Real data shows that delays or misinterpretations in radio messages have cost drivers valuable tenths of a second, fractions that, in Formula One, can determine not just race results but careers. For a team that prides itself on legacy, precision, and unity, this kind of internal exposure is devastating. And yet, Jamiltón, as always, knew exactly what he was doing. This was not sabotage. This was a calculated risk aimed at disrupting a pattern that has gone unchallenged for far too long. In that moment, Jamiltón was not just a driver. He was a whistleblower. And the paddock, whether they admit it or not, felt the impact. The ripple effects of Luis Jamiltón's explosive radio message were immediate. Within minutes, audio engineers, team strategists, and media analysts were rewinding the clip, dissecting every syllable, every pause, every inflection. It was not just what he said, it was what he refused to say that stirred the most suspicion. Jamiltón did not resort to insults or rage. Instead, he weaponized clarity, using a calm but unignorable voice to ask why certain information was withheld, and why his instructions were either delayed or ignored altogether. This was a message loaded with implications. He was no longer willing to accept vague excuses or misplaced priorities. His words struck not like an emotional reaction, but like a carefully measured accusation. Behind the scenes, the situation at Ferrari has been under scrutiny for months. Real-world reports from engineers and insiders suggest a growing rift between factions within the team. Those who believe in preserving traditional hierarchies and those advocating for a more merit-based structure. The favoritism shown toward Leclerc, although never confirmed publicly, has been whispered about in corners of the paddock, with some suggesting that certain strategic decisions have consistently worked to his advantage, even when it meant compromising Jamiltón's position. If true, this presents not only a crisis of fairness but of performance. No team can function at its peak if one of its most experienced drivers feels systematically sidelined. It is worth noting that Jamiltón has never been shy about confronting uncomfortable truths. Whether it be calling out social injustice, challenging governing bodies, or critiquing his own team when necessary, he has built a reputation not only as a competitor but as a truth-teller. That is what makes his recent radio transmissions so unsettling. It was not a slip of the tongue, it was a mirror held up to the organization. And the timing could not have been more intentional. With the world watching and the team under pressure to deliver results, Jamiltón chose that moment to provoke a response. The question now is, will Ferrari respond with transparency or with silence? Because one thing is clear, Jamiltón is done playing politics over the radio. Now he is demanding accountability. As the dust began to settle, it became increasingly clear that Luis Jamiltón's message had pierced more than just his engineer's headset. It had exposed a fracture within Ferrari's internal dynamics that could no longer be ignored. Team members were reportedly seen in intense, closed-door meetings, and sources close to the garage described an atmosphere thick with tension and caution. The usually calm and composed team principal avoided direct questions from journalists, opting instead for vague reassurances that the team remains united. But unity was not what Jamilton's tone on the radio conveyed. It conveyed skepticism, even defiance. The kind of defiance that signals not rebellion, but deep frustration born from being unheard for far too long. More telling, however, was the data that came to light in the hours following the incident. Telematics and radio logs were cross-referenced by independent analysts who noticed a worrying trend: delays in relaying crucial information to Jamilton, while Leclerc received far more frequent, detailed updates on tire performance, fuel management, and traffic positioning. This discrepancy raised serious questions about whether the support provided to both drivers was truly equal. In a team where milliseconds matter and trust between driver and engineer is sacred, such imbalances are not only counterproductive, they are dangerous. Jamilton, with his years of experience and multiple world titles, is not someone who raises concerns lightly. If anything, he has often taken on the burden of diplomacy in high-stakes environments. So when he chose to go public with his frustrations in the form of an explosive, yet composed radio message, it signaled a turning point. He was no longer willing to protect the team from its own inconsistencies. And for a driver of his caliber, trust is not given blindly. It is earned through consistency, transparency, and mutual respect. The lack of any immediate public statement from his race engineer only fueled speculation further. Was the silence a sign of guilt, confusion, or corporate containment? All of this builds a portrait of a team on the edge. Luis Jamilton's message was not an isolated emotional spike. It was the culmination of months of subtle sabotage, whether intentional or systemic. And with each passing day that Ferrari fails to provide a coherent explanation, they risk not only losing the confidence of their most decorated driver, but also their credibility in the eyes of the public and the paddock. Because if Jamilton was right, and the data suggests he might be, then Ferrari is facing a much deeper crisis than it dares to admit. Behind the radio static and brief public statements lies a reality few are brave enough to discuss openly. Luis Jamilton may be deliberately operating within an environment where he is being outmaneuvered not by competitors, but by his own team. The silence from Ferrari following the incident speaks volumes, and the lack of internal accountability only adds to the unease. According to individuals close to the team, this was not the first time Jamilton had raised concerns privately about discrepancies in strategy meetings or questioned certain components installed on his car. On multiple occasions, his feedback during simulator sessions was either dismissed or implemented inconsistently, while Leclerc's preferences appeared to be prioritized almost as a default. These patterns, though subtle, have built a foundation of mistrust that no public relations statement can paper over. To make matters even more pressing, telemetry logs from recent tests, now reviewed by independent engineers, revealed marginal, yet repeated differences in fuel load estimates and battery deployment strategies between Jamilton and Leclerc. While the variations might seem minor in isolation, when compounded over a race weekend, they shape the outcome of strategy choices and overall car performance. One insider remarked that these differences were often explained away by team staff as preference-based or due to differing driving styles. But the consistency of the imbalance has become impossible to ignore. Luis Jamilton, known for his precision and his obsessive attention to detail, does not miss these things. He has spent over a decade understanding every mechanical nuance of the machines he drives. For him, a difference in tire pressure or a shift in engine mapping is not technical noise. It is a signal, a pattern. And when these signals repeatedly point in one direction, favoring Leclerc, he does not interpret it as coincidence. His recent message over the radio, then, was less a complaint and more a strategic alarm, a way to force transparency by taking the issue beyond private walls and into public ears. Even fans have started to piece together the dots. On social media, comparisons between team radio transcripts and pit stop timings have circulated with growing intensity. Many now suspect that Jamilton is being set up to underperform, not through direct sabotage, but by a quiet, methodical chipping away of his competitive edge. In a sport where trust is supposed to be absolute, the suggestion that internal bias could influence performance is explosive. And Jamilton, by exposing this possibility, is not just risking his relationship with Ferrari. He is challenging the very structure of power within the team. What makes Luis Jamilton's current situation even more disturbing is the historical precedent it echoes. Throughout motorsport history, there have been subtle cases where elite drivers found themselves on the wrong side of a team's internal politics. Cases where favor was not earned through merit, but granted through alignment with certain individuals at the top. In the case of Jamilton and Ferrari, whispers of favoritism toward Leclerc have long simmered beneath the surface, but the recent radio exchange has brought them crashing into the spotlight. What once seemed like isolated oversights now appear to form a calculated pattern, one that risks alienating not only Jamiltón, but also the integrity of the entire engineering department. Several reports suggest that Jamiltón has been requesting specific upgrades that consistently arrive late or in incomplete configurations. Meanwhile, Leclerc's side of the garage seems to benefit from prompt technical refinements and seamless data implementation. One such example was the deployment of a new rear suspension component, introduced under the radar during a testing session earlier this year. While both drivers were supposed to evaluate its performance, only Leclerc received the updated part for the full session. Official team communication later described the discrepancy as logistical, but Jamilton's facial expression during post-session interviews told another story: disappointment mixed with resolve. Even the engineer's body language during team briefings has not escaped scrutiny. Multiple observers noted how Leclerc's engineer maintained a more collaborative and encouraging tone, while Jamiltón often faced curt responses and hasty instructions. These micro-behaviors, while subtle, accumulate over time and shape the psychological terrain in which a driver must perform. For someone like Jamiltón, whose driving thrives on trust and synchronicity with his crew, the absence of that harmony is more than a minor irritation. It is a strategic handicap. And yet, instead of exploding in anger, Jamiltón has chosen to weaponize the truth through clarity. His radio message, while emotionally charged, was not reckless. It was carefully phrased, designed to be undeniable without being confrontational. By doing so, he ensured that the world would take notice, that fans, analysts, and former drivers alike would begin to question the inner workings of the most iconic team in motorsport. If Ferrari hoped to manage this quietly, they underestimated Jamilton's intelligence and his refusal to be silenced. Because when a driver of his experience and legacy is pushed to this level of public dissent, it is no longer just about one radio message. It is about the principle of fairness and the silent war being fought behind the scenes. Following Luis Jamiltón's electrifying radio message, the ripple effects within the paddock were immediate and impossible to ignore. Engineers avoided eye contact, public relations officers scrambled for talking points, and Ferrari's official channels remained silent. Too silent for a team usually quick to extinguish media fires. The silence spoke volumes. It suggested that Jamiltón had struck a nerve, that his choice to confront the issue over the airwaves was not a mere emotional outburst, but a calculated strike against a system that had, in his eyes, begun to rot from the inside. This was not just about a misjudged setup or a miscommunication. It was about a structure that seemed designed to limit his success while conveniently favoring Leclerc. In truth, Jamiltón has been no stranger to adversity. His career has been built not on preferential treatment, but on raw skill, meticulous preparation, and an unwavering psychological resilience. However, even he could not have anticipated the quiet resistance he would face upon joining Ferrari. A resistance not overtly hostile, but insidiously passive. From unbalanced component testing to inexplicable delays in telemetry updates, the pattern has become too consistent to ignore. Teammates are supposed to compete, but within a framework of equality. Yet, within Ferrari, Leclerc's side of the garage has increasingly resembled a protected ecosystem, where risk is minimized and resources flow unimpeded. Sources close to the factory in Maranello have revealed that certain engineering decisions, such as aerodynamic configurations and software calibration, have been greenlit for Leclerc without going through the same layers of review required for Jamiltón. Some insiders claim this discrepancy is rooted in long-standing relationships between Leclerc and key technical directors, dating back to his junior years when he was already groomed for leadership within the Scuderia. Meanwhile, Jamiltón, though respected for his legacy, is seen by some as a temporary asset, a tool to draw media attention and external validation, but not one to build the future around. And this is precisely what Jamiltón now seems determined to challenge. His message was a coded defiance, a demand to be seen not just as a headline or a marketing icon, but as an active competitor deserving of the same strategic investment. More than that, it was a dare to his engineer, to the management, and to the institution itself. Recognize what is happening, or risk a fracture that could destabilize not just one season, but the very reputation of Ferrari's driver equality claims. For if even a figure like Jamiltón can be sidelined, then the entire structure must be questioned. As Luis Jamiltón's message continued to circulate across internal channels and media outlets alike, what became increasingly evident was how deeply the tension had been brewing beneath the surface. This was no isolated clash between a driver and his engineer. It was symptomatic of a larger fracture within Ferrari's organizational culture. Despite public affirmations of unity, transparency, and parity between drivers, the reality behind closed doors paints a far more complex picture. Engineers privately admitted that there had been unwritten understandings about who gets the newest parts first and who is prioritized when crucial setup decisions are on the line. More often than not, those benefits leaned in favor of Leclerc. It is no secret that Leclerc has become embedded within the team's long-term strategy. From a branding standpoint, he is young, fluent in Italian, and heavily marketed as the face of Ferrari's next chapter. However, this status comes with consequences. By anchoring their ambitions so tightly to one individual, the team has inadvertently marginalized others, even a 7-time world champion like Jamiltón. While some fans may assume this is simply part of competitive sport, within the paddock it is viewed as a strategic imbalance that could cost Ferrari dearly in both performance and morale. And Jamiltón, ever conscious of his platform and influence, is not letting it go unnoticed. Rather than escalate the situation through angry interviews or passive-aggressive social media posts, he has opted for a more pointed and professional rebellion, letting the truth speak through the data. Internal sources confirm that Jamiltón has begun personally reviewing his telemetry and cross-referencing it with historical race setups and component use, identifying patterns and inconsistencies that seem far too frequent to be coincidental. More than just proving a point, this effort underscores a growing mistrust between the driver and the engineering department, something that, in any elite motorsport team, can be fatal to success. But perhaps the most shocking development has come from within Jamiltón's own circle. Trusted advisors have reportedly begun documenting instances of part shortages, rejected upgrade requests, and last-minute strategy changes that disproportionately affect his side of the garage. These are not minor details. In a sport where thousandths of a second define a legacy, these internal disparities could have devastating consequences. And now that Jamiltón has pulled back the curtain, there is no turning back. His message was not just explosive, it was strategic, calculated, and delivered with the full weight of a champion who knows that silence only protects the system, not the truth. In the aftermath of Luis Jamiltón's explosive radio provocation, the ripple effects have reached beyond the paddock and into the very foundation of how Ferrari manages its internal dynamics. While the team attempted to project calm and cohesion through carefully curated statements, the reality behind the scenes is increasingly difficult to disguise. Engineers have begun to question their own autonomy, mechanics whisper in frustration about inconsistent directives, and team principals are reportedly walking on eggshells, aware that any misstep could further validate Jamiltón's claims. The once unshakable structure of Ferrari's hierarchy is showing signs of strain, and all it took was one brutally honest moment of radio clarity to expose it. But what truly sets this situation apart is how Jamiltón has transformed a moment of frustration into a measured campaign for internal accountability. Far from descending into petty politics, he has leveraged the radio outburst as a catalyst, compelling team leadership to reassess their priorities. Insiders reveal that Jamiltón has pushed for independent audits of car components and insisted on clearer documentation of upgrade distributions. It is a demand for transparency that, while uncomfortable for the team, is rooted in a desire for fairness, something that resonates deeply with fans and fellow drivers alike. Support for Jamiltón has surged in unexpected quarters. Former engineers, technical analysts, and even retired drivers have spoken publicly in his defense, echoing concerns about how favoritism and internal politics can quietly sabotage performance. The sport may present a polished image of unity and respect, but behind the glossy facade, stories like this remind the world that even the most elite teams are vulnerable to dysfunction. And when a driver like Luis Jamiltón, with his unparalleled resume and unshakable sense of justice, takes a stand, the motorsport world listens. Now, the question is not whether Jamiltón was right to speak out. It is what Ferrari will do next. Will they confront the uncomfortable truth he laid bare, or will they retreat into silence, hoping the news cycle moves on? Either path carries consequences. Because one thing is certain, Jamiltón has made it clear that he will not be quiet, he will not be sidelined, and he will not allow a culture of favoritism to define his legacy. In challenging his engineer, he has challenged the system itself, and that, more than anything, could reshape the future of the team forever.